Summer was in full swing, and the small town seemed quieter than ever. The five friends, Mark, Claire, John, Mary, and Tom, were bored, not knowing what to do with their excess free time. On that hot, muggy afternoon, they decided to venture into the city centre in search of something interesting. After hours of wandering aimlessly, they passed a narrow street that they rarely visited. It was then that they spotted the antique store, an old brick building with a worn wooden sign that read, "Relics of the Past." Curious, they decided to go in. The interior of the store was dark and poorly lit, the air smelling of dust and something indescribably old. Strange and mysterious objects were scattered across shelves and tables, rusty pocket watches, hand mirrors with ornate frames, and, in the corner, a display case full of porcelain dolls, all showing unsettling expressions. It was Mark who noticed the doll. It was lying in a corner outside the shop window, almost hidden by a pile of old newspapers. It was a large doll, about 60 centimeters long, with a dirty, faded dress and disheveled hair that must once have been blonde. Its blue eyes shone strangely vividly, as if they were observing everything around them. Mark carefully picked up the doll and lifted it, examining it closely. "Look what I found," he said, attracting the attention of his friends. "God, Mark, that's awful," exclaimed Claire, taking a step back. "That doll looks like something out of a horror movie." Mary approached, frowning. "That'll give us a good scare," she said, with a mischievous smile. "Imagine if we used this doll in a summoning game or something." John's eyes lit up at the idea. "It would be a great way to scare the crowd," he agreed, while Tom just looked on with a suspicious expression. Suddenly, the sound of a dry cough caught everyone's attention. The store owner, a thin man with grey hair and wrinkled skin, appeared from behind a curtain. He looked at the teenagers with a deep, enigmatic gaze, then focused on the doll in Mark's hands. "This doll shouldn't be touched," he said, his voice sounding low and hoarse. "It's very old and carries with it a complicated history." Mark shrugged, ignoring the warning. "How much is it?" he asked, still holding the doll. The old man hesitated for a moment before answering. "If you really want it, you can have it for $5, he said, his eyes fixed on Mark's. "But remember, it's not a toy. There are things that can't be explained." The friends laughed at the old man's dramatics, but Mark pulled a $5 bill out of his pocket and handed it to the man. "Great, let's take it," he said, with a smile on his face. As they left the store, Mark carrying the doll under his arm, the old man followed them to the door, his eyes still fixed on them. "Be careful," he said, his words echoing in the teenagers' minds as the door closed behind them. The group didn't take much notice of the warning. The doll was now theirs, and they were eager to see how far they could take the game. And so, what began as an ordinary afternoon became the prelude to a sequence of events that none of them would ever forget. They didn't know it, but the monotonous summer would soon become a succession of restless nights and gloomy days, with the doll's presence casting an ever larger shadow over their lives. On returning to Mark's house, the group was full of excitement and anticipation. The old doll, now wrapped in brown paper, was left on the living room table while everyone settled down around it. The heat of the day still hung in the air, but the adrenaline of the new acquisition brought a sense of excitement to the group. "Let's take a closer look," suggested Mary, pulling out the package with a smile on her face. Mark unwrapped the doll with a mixture of pride and nervousness, revealing its worn appearance. Claire and Tomsey approached, looking at the doll with curious and slightly suspicious eyes. "What's so special about that?" asked Raphael, trying to hide his discomfort. "She looks like one of those old dolls my grandmother has in the attic." Mark laughed and shook his head. "It's just an old doll, but look at it. It looks a bit sinister, don't you think? I think it's a good idea for some fun." "Yeah, it could be fun," agreed John, still with an expression of excitement. "Let's play a summoning game. I saw something like that online. We just need an old doll for it." "Are you sure about that?" asked Claire, raising an eyebrow. What if the old man's story has some truth to it? We don't want to mess with something we don't understand. Oh, relax, replied John, waving his hand. It's just a game. If it doesn't work out, at least we'll have a funny story to tell. The friends agreed, and the atmosphere was filled with a playful energy. As the sun began to set, they decided to prepare everything for the game. Mark turned off the lights in the room and lit some candles around the doll, creating a more suitable environment for the invocation. They followed a set of improvised instructions found on a mystery and paranormal website, forming a circle of candles around the doll. "Let's see if we can make something happen," said Mark, with a defiant smile. The group positioned themselves around the doll, holding hands and beginning to recite the words of the ritual. The atmosphere was tense, and the candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, it seemed that the energy in the room was changing, but soon a feeling of disinterest took over. The words of the ritual seemed to waver in the darkness, and nothing strange happened. "See, I told you nothing would happen," said John, laughing. "It was just a waste of time." They began to disperse, laughing and talking about other things. Claire, still a little nervous, took the doll and put it back on Mark's shelf, intending to leave it there until the next day. The group said goodbye and left, each going home. Mark, now alone, felt a chill as he passed through the dark room. He looked at the doll, which was perfectly aligned in its position. A slight shiver ran down his spine, but he tried to ignore it, attributing it to the tense atmosphere of the game. That night, Mark lay in bed, trying to relax after his hectic day. However, the feeling that something was wrong persisted. As the night wore on, he began to hear unexplained sounds coming from the living room. Light footsteps and hushed whispers filled the silence of the house. Mark got up to check, but found nothing out of place. Back in bed, he struggled to fall asleep, but the image of the doll, with its fixed, implacable eyes, continued to disturb him. As the night wore on, a small detail began to bother Mark. He couldn't help but think of the old man's words from the store, and the warning now seemed more sinister than before. That night, little did the group of friends know that the doll was not just an old toy, but the beginning of a nightmare that was about to unfold. The next morning, the group met again at Mark's house, excited to talk about the previous night's game. The sun was shining brightly and the heat was back, but that didn't dampen the teenagers' enthusiasm. "So, how was your evening?" asked John, as he sat down on the sofa next to Claire and Mary. Tom was checking his cell phone, and Mark entered the room with a tired look on his face. "I couldn't sleep properly," confessed Mark, as he settled into an armchair. The house seemed to be full of strange noises. "It was just your fear playing tricks on you," John replied, laughing. "It must have been nothing." "I don't know," said Claire, with a tone of concern. "Maybe we should have taken the old man's warning more seriously." "Oh, enough of that," John cut in, standing up. "Let's focus on what we're going to do today. We still have the doll. How about we play again?" Mark nodded, trying to hide his apprehension. "We can try again, but perhaps more carefully this time." After a leisurely breakfast, they decided to take another look at the doll. Mark and John went to the shelf where they had left the doll, but to everyone's surprise, it wasn't there. "Where's the doll?" asked Raphael, looking around. "I put it here last night." The others began to search the room, looking in every corner, but the doll seemed to have disappeared. Claire began to feel uncomfortable. "Do you think someone might have tampered with it?" "That's not possible," replied Mark. "Nobody came in here but us." The search for the doll continued without success, and the group decided to take a break. They tried to ignore what had happened and went out into the yard to play, but the feeling of unease continued to hang over them. Later in the evening, Mark was home alone when he decided to look for the doll once more. With the living room light on and a flashlight in hand, he searched the place again, to no avail. His unease was growing, and he began to wonder if something was really wrong. Suddenly, while he was checking the attic, Mark heard a low, dragging sound coming from downstairs. His heart began to beat faster. He went downstairs cautiously, and when he reached the living room, he found the doll exactly where it had been before, on the table in the center of the room. Mark froze at the sight of the doll. He couldn't believe that after all his efforts to find it, it had appeared there on its own. He approached it slowly, trying to understand what was going on. The doll looked even more sinister in the light of the room. Its blue eyes seemed to shine brightly, as if they were watching him. "You must be imagining things," Mark muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that he was just tired and stressed. He picked up the doll and put it back on the shelf, trying to ignore the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, Mark got ready for bed, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. The doll seemed to have become a symbol of an unsettling mystery that he couldn't understand. What had caused the sudden change? And why did the doll seem to move on its own? Mark didn't know, but the doubt persisted, and a growing feeling that something more sinister was coming began to form in his mind. Meanwhile, the group of friends were about to discover that the doll's presence in their lives was not just a coincidence. The first sign that something was deeply wrong had been given, and the true story behind the doll was slowly beginning to reveal itself, like a shadow stretching out as the night progressed. The next morning, the group met again, this time at Mary's house. They were eager to discuss the strange events of the night before and try to understand what was happening to the doll. The sun was shining brightly, and the house was filled with a pleasant warmth, contrasting with the tension that hung over the teenagers. "So, what do you think is going on with the doll?" asked Claire, as she prepared some drinks for her friends. "I don't know, but that was really weird," replied Mark, sitting down on a sofa and trying to look calmer than he really felt. "She just appeared back in the room as if she'd been put there by someone." John tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe we messed with something we shouldn't have, or it's just a coincidence." Raphael, with a worried look, added, "I still think we should take the old man's warning more seriously." What he said was sounding more and more true. "You're exaggerating," said John, with a sideways smile. "Let's move on. We have to go to school now." His friends agreed and they left for school, but Mark's restlessness didn't subside. Throughout the day, he tried to concentrate on his lessons, but the image of the doll and the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave his mind. After school, the group decided to meet at Mark's house for another research session. When they arrived, they noticed that the atmosphere was different from the one they had left. There was a slight chill in the room, and a strange feeling hung in the air. Mark went to the living room, where the doll was on display again, to find the best way to check for anything strange. To his surprise, the doll looked different. Her posture was altered, as if she had been moved. Her friends noticed the change and approached her. "Did you see that?" Claire asked with a nervous tone. "The doll was in a different position yesterday." Mark shook his head. "I put her here exactly as she was before. I don't know how she could have moved." Mary, trying to stay calm, suggested, "Let's use the camera on the cell phone to record and see if we can capture anything." They positioned the camera pointed at the doll and started recording, laughing nervously as they did so. After a few minutes of filming, they decided to go to the kitchen and leave the camera running in the living room. The group was in the kitchen, chatting and trying to distract themselves, when they heard a noise coming from the living room. It was the sound of something falling and dragging across the floor. They looked at each other, fear on their faces, and went into the living room. When they entered, they found the doll lying on the floor, one of its eyes broken. The surrounding candles were unlit, and the room was inexplicably cold. John, with an air of disdain, approached to pick up the doll. "It's just a coincidence," he said, trying to keep control. "Let's see what we've captured on the recording." They watched the video from the camera, and what they saw left everyone speechless. The doll, in the recording, seemed to move on its own. Not in a dramatic way, but subtly. The head turned slightly, and the hands moved from side to side. "This can't be happening," muttered Mark, his voice shaking. "Did you see that?" The doll actually moved. The friends were in shock, and the atmosphere in the room became heavy. Claire tried to comfort Mark, while John tried to rationalize the event. "It's just a piece of video that might have failed," John insisted, but his voice betrayed his own doubt. As the group tried to understand what was going on, a growing sense that something more sinister was at play settled in their minds. The appearance of the doll and the subsequent events were only the beginning of something much deeper and more disturbing. And as night approached, the sense of fear and tension continued to grow, signaling that the true test of what they had awakened to was about to begin. The following days were marked by a constant feeling of discomfort. The doll's presence became a source of anguish for the group. Even when it wasn't in the room, the thought of what it might have aroused seemed to hang over them. On Saturday morning, Mary proposed a meeting to discuss what to do next. The group gathered at Mark's house, where the atmosphere was particularly tense. The doll was now tucked away in the living room cupboard out of sight, but everyone's unease seemed to be growing. "We need to do something," Mary began, looking at her friends. "This is getting out of hand. That video was awful. The doll is moving on its own, and that's not a coincidence." "I've already tried to explain it rationally," John tried to justify himself. "It could be a trick of the camera, or maybe the doll was badly positioned." "It's not just that," said Claire with a tone of concern. "I've also been doing a bit of research. In some cases, antique dolls are used in rituals to summon spirits. What if the spirit we invoke is real?" "Let's go in parts," Mark interrupted, trying to stay calm. "We may have done something wrong, but we don't know what's really going on. The best thing is not to panic and try to figure out what to do." The friends agreed and decided to seek help. After some research, they discovered that a specialist in paranormal phenomena would be available for a consultation. They arranged a visit for the following day, hoping to find answers and, if possible, resolve the situation. The night before the specialist's visit was the most disturbing. Each of the friends had disturbing nightmares, full of images of the doll and a sense of persecution. Mark, in particular, was haunted by a dream in which the doll followed him through deserted streets, its eyes glowing a sinister shade of red. When he woke up, he was sweating and panting, and the feeling of fear seemed too real to be just a nightmare. On Sunday, the group was anxious and apprehensive as they welcomed the expert, an elderly man with a serious expression and piercing eyes. His name was Mr. Gomes, and he had been dealing with cases of paranormal phenomena for many years. "Hello, I'm Mr. Gomes," he said, entering the room. "I heard about what happened to the doll. Let's have a look and see what we can find out." The group took Mr. Gomes to the cupboard where the doll was kept. He examined the doll carefully, observing its details and the environment around it. After a while, he stood up and addressed the teenagers. "I sense a disturbing energy," he began, his tone grave. "This doll may be connected to something deeper than you realize. Sometimes antique objects like this can serve as a channel for spirits. You'll need to carry out a more detailed investigation." While Mr. Gomes prepared his equipment and began to carry out some analyses, the group watched in silence. The tension in the room was palpable, and the feeling of being in imminent danger hung over everyone. The specialist asked them to leave for a while to carry out a full analysis. During this time, the friends tried to distract themselves, but the anticipation and fear were palpable. The idea that the doll could be possessed by an evil spirit was starting to become a reality. Finally, Mr. Gomes called them back into the room. His face was serious, and he began to speak in a deep voice. "What I discovered is disturbing," he said. "The energy emanating from this doll is extremely negative. It's as if it's trying to communicate, but in a way that's not healthy for anyone here." The group was in shock, and the feeling of terror was intensifying. The expert explained that the doll was probably a vehicle for a spirit that was trying to manifest itself aggressively. The only solution would be to perform a cleansing ritual to try to drive away the evil presence. While Mr. Gomes prepared for the ritual, the group prepared to face what was coming next. The feeling that something was about to happen was almost unbearable. The terror that had once seemed like a game was now becoming a terrifying reality. And as night approached, everyone knew that the real battle to save themselves and the doll was about to begin. As evening approached, the tension in Mark's house grew. Mr. Gomes was preparing for the cleaning ritual, and the group was on alert, aware that what was to come would not be easy. The atmosphere was full of anticipation and fear. The specialist had set up a makeshift altar in the center of the room. White candles were arranged in a circle around the doll, and he had placed some symbols and amulets to help protect the area. The group watched anxiously as Mr. Gomes began to recite prayers and make hand gestures. During the ritual, it is crucial that everyone remains silent and concentrates only on what is happening, instructed Mr. Gomes. Any distraction can interfere with the process. The teenagers nodded and positioned themselves around the altar, each fighting their own anxiety. Claire was especially nervous, her hands shaking as she held a candle. Mr. Gomes began to chant words in an ancient language, and the room fell silent. All that could be heard was the sound of the expert's murmur and the crackling of the candles. The group tried to relax, but the feeling that something was about to happen was inescapable. As the ritual progressed, the candles began to oscillate strangely, as if an invisible current of air was moving them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and an uncomfortable chill spread through the room. Mark watched the doll, which was in the center of the circle, and noticed that its eyes seemed to glow intensely, as if they were absorbing the light from the candles. Suddenly, a loud, abrupt sound filled the room, as if something was dragging or banging against the walls. Everyone turned in fright to the source of the sounds, but Mr. Gomes continued to recite his prayers, unperturbed. "Stay calm," he said, without looking away from the altar. "These phenomena are signs that the energy is reacting to the ritual. It's important that you remain calm." The noise continued, and the tension in the room grew. John tried to comfort Claire, but she was visibly shaken. Mary stood close by, trying to concentrate on the specialist's instructions. As the ritual progressed, Mr. Gomes paused and approached the doll, examining it carefully. He then began to use incense, spreading a thick smoke around the doll and along the circle of candles. The strong, unusual smell filled the room, causing additional discomfort for the group. Suddenly, a strong wind swept through the room, blowing out all the candles and causing the smoke from the incense to billow out. The group was left in complete darkness, except for the dim light coming from the street. The feeling of dread was palpable, and the silence that followed seemed deafening. Mr. Gomes quickly lit a flashlight and began to circle the doll with a powdery substance, apparently to contain any residual energy. The group was petrified, their gazes fixed on the doll and the expert's actions. After a few tense moments, the wind ceased and the room returned to normal. The candles were relit, and Mr. Gomes ended the ritual with a final prayer. He then turned to the teenagers, looking exhausted but relieved. "The ritual has been performed successfully," he said, with a grave tone. "The evil presence has been removed, but the doll may still contain some residual energy. It's best to keep it away from you and carry out additional cleaning in your home." The group, relieved, thanked Mr. Gomes for his help. The feeling that the danger was gone, at least temporarily, brought momentary relief. However, tension and fear still hung over them. The idea that the doll could have been just the beginning of something much more sinister still tormented them. The group said goodbye to the expert and, after his departure, began to discuss what to do with the doll and how to ensure that whatever had been awakened didn't come back. What they didn't know was that, although the ritual might have removed the presence momentarily, the forces that had been awakened weren't ready to disappear so easily. As night fell and darkness overtook the house, the group prepared to face whatever came next. The feeling that something was still lurking continued to cast a shadow over their lives, promising that the real battle was far from over. After the ritual, the group was looking forward to a period of tranquility. The feeling of relief brought a false sense of security, and for a moment, it seemed that the danger had passed. However, this calm was about to be interrupted in an unexpected way. The next morning, Mark woke up feeling uneasy. There was something strangely silent in the house, and he couldn't identify the source of his unease. While getting ready for the day, he noticed that some of the things in the living room were out of place. The books, which he had left organized on the bookshelf, were scattered on the floor. He tried to justify it as an effect of the wind, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. Mary, Claire, John, and Tom also began to notice changes in their routines. Mary found a handwritten note in her notebook with a simple message. "You found me." The note was signed with a drawing of a doll. Although she tried not to panic, the strangeness of the note made her extremely uncomfortable. Claire received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, the line was silent, and she felt a chill run down her spine when she heard heavy breathing on the other end. Suspicious, she decided not to return the call and to tell her friends. John, on the other hand, found messages on his cell phone that seemed to have been sent by himself, but with a strange and threatening tone. The messages talked about doing justice and bringing balance, and John couldn't remember sending them. Tom felt the direct impact of the events the most. In his house, the electrical appliances began to fail without explanation. The light in the living room flickered incessantly, and the radio tuned in to a strange talk station, full of incomprehensible noises and mumbles. He also found the doll in his room, without knowing how it had ended up there. The group met again at Mark's house, worried about the strange signs they were experiencing. Each person recounted their experiences and their fear that something was manifesting itself in a more aggressive way. "I can't believe this is happening," said Mary, visibly shaken. "That ritual should have put an end to all this." "It looks like the doll still has some power," commented Mark, looking at the cupboard where the doll was kept. "Mr. Gomes told us that residual energy could be a problem. But why are things getting worse now?" Raphael, with an expression of despair, suggested, "What if the doll isn't alone? What if there's something else, something that's waiting to manifest itself?" Feeling that they were only scratching the surface of the problem, the group decided to investigate further. They went back to Mr. Gomes to seek more information and perhaps a definitive solution. While they waited for the specialist to arrive, they began to do their own research into the doll's history and similar paranormal phenomena. They discovered accounts of people who had had similar experiences and how the entities involved often manifested themselves more aggressively when they felt threatened. With each discovery, the feeling that they were in great danger only grew. They felt that what they had awakened was becoming stronger and that they needed to act quickly to avoid an even more terrifying outcome. As night approached and fear continued to spread among them, they knew they had to face whatever was coming their way. The next encounter with Mr. Gomes would be crucial in determining not only the doll's fate, but also their future. The battle to stay safe had only just begun, and the real test was yet to come. The group was restless as they waited for Mr. Gomes to arrive for the second meeting. The sun was setting, and the shadows were beginning to lengthen across the room. The atmosphere in Mark's house was full of tension and anticipation. Everyone was immersed in their own thoughts, fighting the anxiety that grew with the twilight. When the specialist finally arrived, his expression was one of concern. He entered the house and made a quick assessment of the surroundings, noticing the discomfort and fear that hung in the air. The situation was more serious than he had anticipated. The room was full of lit candles and amulets, which now seemed insufficient in the face of what was happening. "Let's sit down and talk about what's going on," said Mr. Gomes, with a tone of seriousness. He gestured for everyone to settle around the table. The group recounted each of their recent events, from the strange messages to the problems with the appliances and the doll reappearing in unexpected places. Mr. Gomes listened attentively, noting details and asking clarifying questions. "It seems that the doll's energy is more active than expected," he began after listening to the reports. "The presence you have awakened may be trying to communicate, or worse still, manifesting itself in a more aggressive way. We need to find out more about the doll's origin and how to deal with the residual energy that seems to be intensifying the phenomena." The expert suggested that they carry out an investigation into the antique store where the doll was bought. Sometimes the history of objects can reveal clues about what is going on. If we find something that can explain the doll's origin, it can help us better understand how to deal with the situation. The group agreed with the plan and decided that the next day they would go to the store where the doll had been bought. Mr. Gomes recommended that, in the meantime, they continue to protect the house with amulets and prayers, and that they avoid interacting with the doll until they could find out more. That night, the feeling of unease in the house increased. Every little sound seemed amplified, and the darkness seemed more threatening. The tension was palpable as the group tried to prepare for what would come next. Claire, still disturbed by the strange messages and calls she had received, tried to distract herself by reading about paranormal phenomena on the internet. She found several accounts of possessive objects and how they could affect their victims. What she read seemed to align with her own experiences and increased her fear that what was happening to them was more serious than they had imagined. Meanwhile, John and Tom were up all night, discussing possible strategies for dealing with the situation. They were determined to protect their friends and themselves, but the uncertainty of what else they might face was terrifying. Mr. Gomes, for his part, made a final check of the preparations for the following day. He was determined to find a solution and hoped that the visit to the antique store would bring the answers they needed. As the dawn progressed and the group tried to find some relief from their fear, they knew that the next day's investigation could be the key to solving the doll's mystery. With a mixed feeling of hope and terror, they prepared to face the next step in their fight against the unknown. The night was long and full of expectations, and dawn brought a new opportunity to face the challenges that lay ahead. With the knowledge that what they would find in the store could change the course of the situation, the group was ready to face whatever was lurking, in the hope that the answers they sought would help them to finally find peace. The group woke up early, with the weight of fear still hanging over them. The visit to the antique store was the next crucial step in their attempt to unravel the mysteries surrounding the doll. As they prepared to leave, a feeling of nervousness mixed with hope accompanied them. The antique store, called Memories of the Past, was a small old establishment on a quiet street in the city. The weathered facade was covered in dust, and the rusty sign looked like it had seen better days. The entrance was decorated with a small bell that made a soft sound when the door opened. When the group entered, they were greeted by the smell of aged wood and old products. The shelves were filled with a variety of objects, from antique furniture to small relics and, of course, dolls. The store was filled with an atmosphere of nostalgia and mystery, with each item telling a story of its own. The store owner, an elderly woman with grey hair and a curious look on her face, approached to offer help. She was dressed in a simple dress and an apron that looked like it had been worn for many years. Her gaze analyzed the group with interest as they explained the reason for their visit. "We're looking for information about a doll we bought here a few days ago," said Mark, trying to be as direct as possible. "We'd like to know more about its origin and history." The lady looked at them with an expression of surprise and caution. "Old dolls can have very interesting stories, and some of them can have disturbing pasts," she commented. "I can check my records to see if I can find anything about the doll you mention." While she headed to the office to look around, the group began to examine the store in more detail. Every corner seemed to hide secrets, and they were on the alert for any clues that might be hidden among the old objects. Claire found a display case with several antique dolls, including some that were of a similar style to the one they had bought. She looked at them carefully, noticing that some had disturbing features, glass eyes that seemed to follow their movements and facial expressions that were unsettling. "Look at this," said Claire, calling to the others. "These dolls, they look strange, almost as if they were more than just toys." Mary approached and examined the dolls next to Claire. "I really don't like the way these seem to be watching us," she said, with a tone of discomfort in her voice. Meanwhile, the lady returned with an old record book. She began to leaf through it, and the teenagers waited in silence, eager to hear what she had found. "I found a note about the doll you bought," said the lady, handing Mark a copy of the book entry. It was acquired from an auction a few months ago, and the note said that the doll was from a private collection. There isn't much additional information about its origin, but it mentions that the previous owner had an interest in items with dark histories. Mark read the note and, as he checked, noticed a mention of a name: Elena. Elena. Could be an important name, he thought, sharing the information with the group. "That's all I could find," said the lady, with a look of concern. "I suggest you be careful. Sometimes these items can carry energies or stories that are best left in the past." The group thanked the lady and said goodbye, leaving the store with more questions than answers. The mention of the name Elena added a new layer of mystery to the situation. They were determined to find out more about this possible connection and how it related to the doll's behavior. As they drove back to Mark's house, the sense of urgency was palpable. The visit to the store had raised new questions and deepened the enigma surrounding the doll. With the name Elena in mind, the group knew they needed to continue their investigation, determined to uncover the truth and face whatever lay ahead. Their journey was far from over, and discovering the doll's origin seemed to be the key to solving the mystery. With the weight of the revelations on their shoulders, the group prepared for the next step in their fight against the unknown forces that threatened their lives. Back at Mark's house, the group met to discuss the name Elena and what it might mean. The atmosphere was tense, and the sense of urgency was palpable. They knew that the next step was to seek out more information about Elena and her possible link to the doll and the paranormal events they were facing. "We need to find out any information about Elena," said Mark, looking at the others with determination. "Let's see if we can find out who she was and what her story was." The group decided to use the internet to investigate, taking advantage of the afternoon to do an in-depth search. Mary was in charge of looking for historical records and archives about people called Elena, who might have a connection to ancient items or paranormal phenomena. Meanwhile, John and Claire scoured auction websites and antique stores for any mention of the doll or the name Elena. Raphael, for his part, began researching accounts of people who had dealt with possessive objects and how they had coped. As the day went on, the group gathered some interesting information, although nothing conclusive. Mary found an old article about a woman called Elena Salgado, who had lived at the beginning of the 20th century. According to the article, Elena was known for her collection of antique items and had been an enigmatic figure in the community. There were rumors that she practiced rituals and had a particular interest in objects with dark histories. "This Elena Salgado seems to be a possible candidate," said Mary, showing the article to the others. She had a collection of antique items and seemed to be involved in unconventional practices. John and Claire found some references to an Elena in auction records, but there wasn't enough information to make a clear connection. They also discovered that the antique store where the doll was bought had acquired several items from private collections, including Elena's. Tom found reports of people who had faced similar situations involving ancient and spiritual objects. Many of them mentioned the need to get rid of the items and perform cleansing rituals to ward off negative energies. "It seems that Elena Salgado's story may be connected to our doll," said Raphael. "The accounts I've found speak of objects that carry the energies and intentions of their former owners. This could explain why the doll is acting this way." With this new information, the group realized that Elena could have been a central figure in causing the problems they were facing. They decided that the next step would be to find out more details about Elena's life and find out if there were any records of paranormal events associated with her or her collection. Mary was in charge of looking for records in local archives and old libraries, while Mark and John planned to visit the antique store again to ask more questions. Claire and Tomsey would prepare to carry out a cleansing ritual at home, following the guidelines they had found in the reports. As night approached, the group was exhausted but determined. The connection with Elena Salgado seemed to be an important clue to solving the mystery of the doll. They knew there was still a lot to discover and face, and they were ready to move forward, whatever challenges they might encounter. With the weight of their new discoveries and the feeling that they were closer to understanding what was going on, the group prepared for the next step in their investigation. Elena's past seemed to play a crucial role in solving the mystery, and they were determined to unravel all the layers of this sinister story. The group was in a frenzy as they prepared for another visit to the antique store. Mark and John had decided to go alone, with the aim of questioning the owner about Elena Salgado's story and finding out more about the doll. Meanwhile, Mary and Claire dedicated themselves to exploring historical records and locations in search of more clues, while Tom prepared the space for a cleansing ritual, believing that this could help dissipate the negative energy. When Mark and John arrived at the store, the owner was standing at the counter, apparently surprised by their visit. The expression of concern on her face did not go unnoticed. "Hello again," said Mark, trying to maintain a friendly tone despite the tension he was feeling. "We're back to ask some additional questions about the doll and the woman called Elena Salgado. We've found some information that seems to link her to the doll, and we wanted to understand it better." The lady looked at them with a hesitant expression before finally nodding. "Elena's story is a bit complicated," she began, looking around as if to check if anyone was listening. There were rumors about her practicing ancient rituals and collecting items that she believed had special properties. "Can you tell us more about these rituals?" asked John, leaning forward, eager for answers. "Most people thought that Elena was involved in black magic practices," the lady said quietly. "She believed that the objects she collected had the power to connect the world of the living with that of the dead. Some people believe that she used these items to try to communicate with spirits." Mark and John exchanged glances. "What about the doll? Do you know if it had any special meaning for Elena?" asked Mark. "I'm not sure if the doll was one of her favorites, but it was definitely part of her collection," replied the lady. There was a story among the old residents that Elena was obsessed with this particular doll, believing that it had a powerful force and a spirit trapped inside it. The information made Mark's stomach turn. "And is there any way of knowing what happened to Elena and her items after her death?" "Elena's family considered her an eccentric person," said the lady. "After her death, many of her items were sold at auctions. The store where you bought the doll was one of those that acquired part of her collection. Some people believe that the objects still carry Elena's energy and her rituals." With these revelations, Mark and John felt an additional weight on their shoulders. They knew they had to find a way to deal with the energy that was still present in the doll. Elena Salgado's story seemed to indicate that she had left a lasting and possibly dangerous mark on the objects she had accumulated. Back at the house, Mary and Claire had found some additional references to Elena Salgado and her collection, including accounts from former residents about the spiritual activity associated with her house. Raphael, meanwhile, was preparing the environment for the cleansing ritual, feeling that it was the only way to try to reverse what was happening. The group met to discuss the newly discovered information. They were determined to act on what they had learned and try to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. "Elena's story is more complex than we imagined," said Mark, as the group prepared for the ritual. "Now we know that the doll may be more than just an object. It may be a conduit for something much more sinister." With the cleansing ritual beginning, the group was ready to face whatever was holding the doll and the spirit associated with it. They hoped that the cleansing would help to alleviate the negative influence and reverse the disturbing effects they had faced. The ritual was a collective effort, with everyone contributing prayers and cleansing intentions. The atmosphere in the room was charged with energy as they worked together to drive away the unknown forces that had invaded their lives. The outcome of this effort would remain unknown until they could assess whether the cleansing had brought any relief. With the ritual concluded, the group was anxious to see if there would be any change in the doll's dynamics and in the overall situation. They knew there was still more to be discovered and faced, but they were determined to solve Elena's mystery and restore peace to their lives. After the cleansing ritual, the group was in a state of anticipation. The following days were marked by an unsettling silence, which seemed to contrast with the turmoil they had experienced over the previous weeks. The doll, which had previously seemed a constant and sinister presence, was now tucked away in a corner of the room, covered in a white cloth. Mary and Claire continued their investigations, reviewing historical documents and records in search of more clues, while Mark and John kept an eye on the doll and any changes that might occur. Raphael, after the ritual was completed, dedicated himself to researching additional forms of spiritual protection and ways of preventing the possible recurrence of paranormal phenomena. The first few days after the ritual were marked by a tense calm. The feeling of oppression that had settled over the house seemed to have subsided. The group felt cautiously optimistic, but they knew they had to wait to be sure that the negative presence had been dispelled. One night, while everyone was getting ready for bed, Claire was awoken by a noise coming from the living room. The sound of something falling made her heart race. Cautiously, she got up and went into the living room. What she saw stunned her. The doll was gone from where it had been left. She was now in a different position, sitting on a chair, her gaze fixed on Claire. Claire called the others immediately. Mark, John, and Mary arrived in the room, surprised to see the doll in its new position. Tom was also called in to analyze the situation. "It can't just be a coincidence," said Raphael, examining the doll with an attentive eye. The doll was clearly somewhere else before the ritual. Something is still going on. The group decided that the best approach would be to repeat the cleansing ritual, this time with more detailed preparation and a more rigorous approach. They gathered, each dedicating themselves to the process with seriousness and attention. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and a sense of urgency as they worked to purify the environment once again. During the ritual, emotions were running high. The tension in the air seemed to intensify, and the group felt the presence of Elena's spirit more strongly than before. The words of purification were recited with fervor, and every gesture was made with the hope of completely dissipating the negative energy. After the second ritual, the doll remained silent. There were no more unexplained movements, and the atmosphere in the house seemed to have regained a sense of normality. The group began to relax a little, feeling more confident that they had managed to deal with the negative influence that had disrupted their lives. Over the next few days, they continued to monitor the situation, but found no further signs of paranormal activity. A sense of calm seemed to have settled in, and the doll was finally placed back in the antique store, where it was carefully stored and kept under observation. As the group reflected on the experience, they felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. They had learned a lot about the nature of paranormal phenomena and the importance of dealing with such situations seriously and with respect. The mystery of Elena Salgado and the doll had been solved, but the experience left a lasting mark on each of them. They knew they had faced something that tested their deepest beliefs and fears. Now, with peace restored, they were ready to move on, carrying with them the lessons learned and the certainty that they had faced a real force from beyond. The group said goodbye with a sense of closure, recognizing the importance of being prepared to deal with the unknown and the need to respect forces that cannot be fully understood. The nightmare they had faced had come to an end, but the memory of the experience would remain part of their lives.